Hello everyone, welcome back to my channel. Sorry about the long hiatus there. Um, a little bit unexpected, but not quite unforeseeable. Turns out my son was born, and everything from gaming to writing to YouTube didn't even go on the back burner. It actually more or less just got kicked right out of the kitchen. But he is a few weeks old now and sleeping more, and so going to try to get back into making videos on a regular basis. And with that in mind, my name is James. I am the creator of the Raven of the Scythe fantasy role-playing game. And on this video, I want to talk a little bit about monsters, or specifically monsters and their role in the world. If you're making a fantasy type setting for a role-playing game or a work of fiction or something like that. And by monsters, I mean your more extraordinary creatures, like your griffins and your manticores and your wyverns and things like that. Things that could kind of be considered normal animals, but are kind of fantastical in nature in some ways. And the role that monsters play in your world, as far as their frequency and habitats and stuff like that, that says a lot about the type of world that you are working on. So I guess starting at one extreme is that just saying that these creatures don't exist at all. Like, maybe there's legends about them, maybe there's rumors about them, they show up in old stories and fantastical tapestries and stuff like that, but as far as the actual creatures themselves, you don't see those. The animals that the characters or heroes would encounter would run the scale of like normal mundane creatures that would appear in our world. So characters could find themselves fighting things like grizzly bears and wolves and mountain lions and snakes and alligators and stuff like that, but nothing really fantastical in nature would show up. One of the cool parts about this type of setting is that you could maybe constantly tease at the existence of these types of monsters. Like, maybe there's rumors of a monster that lives in the caves, but the players don't actually encounter it. Maybe they find some old bones or some weird tracks or something like that, but the actual creatures themselves don't really ever make an appearance. And this can be really cool if you are going for a super like low fantasy type setting. The only issue with it is that you can only tease something for so long, and eventually either it's just going to get old, be like, oh, I wonder if there's a monster in these caves, but there probably won't be. And eventually sort of like cryptic clues or tavern stories and stuff like that, that's going to get old. Or when you finally do like lift the curtain and show a monster or something like that, then it changes the nature of the setting entirely, because now you're dealing with a world where these types of creatures do exist. Another type of method of dealing with monsters in a world would be, I think, maybe something you see more often in like Greek mythology, or at least the way it was taught to me, is that you have these fantastic places and these creatures exist maybe like in singular form for a specific reason. Like, maybe there's a temple and a god or a spirit or a wizard or something placed a wyvern there to guard it, or this area has been cursed, so now there's griffins that are like plaguing this one area or something like that. It's not like they're an actual like native species, with their own sort of ecosystems or evolution or anything going on. But it's like the creatures themselves are legendary. It's not, this is where wyverns live, or this would be like where a wyvern lives. This would be where the wyvern lives. And that can be a cool sort of way to bridge the gap if you are going for like more of like a classic type story or something like that. You can use this to really add a lot of flavor to the specific monsters. But the issue with that is that you're not going to have these things showing up on random encounter charts too often. Let me put it that way. So the actual adventures themselves between these encounters with the fantastic creatures or the boss monsters or whatever, that might seem a little bit mundane. But I think this method of dealing with monsters is actually pretty cool, but it also requires a bit of backstory and explanation that you might not necessarily want to go into. And probably my favorite method of dealing with these types of creatures, and the method that I used whenever I was thinking of the types of world that Raven of the Scythe would occupy, is that these creatures are out there and they are understood to a limited degree, but they are also extraordinarily rare. So most people are never going to encounter anything other than mundane type creatures. Of course there are exceptions, but most people aren't going to go into the woods and encounter a horned bear or a drake or a giant spider or something like that. To the point that some people, with relatively good reason, believe that these monsters are fictitious. Now, of course, there would be stories abound about that time that someone a couple of towns over encountered some type of monster, or maybe there is a skull decorating the tavern's common room, or a monstrous pelt is kept as a trophy by like a local lord or a knight or something like that. But it's not something that the average person encounters. So whenever one of these creatures do show up, it can become a source of adventure. So like, perhaps a hydra showed up out of nowhere, and now the town needs to figure out what to do with it. And that is a perfectly good opportunity to enlist the help of some intrepid party of adventurers. And I ended up going with this method because I think this created the most potential for adventure, which is important in a game like this. Because the problem is, if there's only one wyvern that lives at the peak of one mountain, then as soon as the players go up there and kill that wyvern, they become legendary characters in that world. And their role as adventurers at that point is kind of over. Like, at this point, they themselves become mythical creatures for killing, or they become mythical characters because they battled and defeated this mythical creature. And that can be problematic for storytelling because the way most games work is players tend to go from location to location, just slaughtering legendary magical creatures, and so that's going to change the role that they have in that society. So I liked the method that I used just because I think it works well for a game of this type, where you are dealing with sort of mercenary style adventurers who go out and sometimes battle fantastic monsters, but then can go back to town and still, maybe struggle to find a place where they can stay for the night or something like that. Like, there aren't necessarily going to be songs written about them after every single adventure. I guess on the other extreme of that, from these monsters are completely fictitious and just all of the ecologies in the world exist, based on, the real world, would be the common creatures. And this would be a type of world where maybe it's not unheard of for people to have griffin mounts, and maybe the local ruler or whatever keeps a wyvern or a drake or something like that in the castle to use as kind of an intimidation factor or something like that. Or these creatures at that point, the level of magic and fantasticalness of the, I don't know if that's a real word, the level of fantasy in the world goes up a whole lot, but the actual strangeness of these creatures diminish, because now you're dealing with a world where you walk outside and you see some people flying over on their griffins, and then you go back to plowing your field. I think that's more appropriate for a more high magic type world, maybe like World of Warcraft or Dungeons and Dragons or something like that. And that's really not what I was going for with Raven of the Scythe. Now, if you want to create a world like that, by all means, go right ahead. I think there's a lot of potential there, but that's really not what I was going for when I designed the rules, and that's not where my head was at. But I can't think of any reason why it wouldn't work. Like, there's nothing in the game that says there can only be 10 griffins per 100 square miles, nothing like that. And so when I'm talking about monsters, so far I've been talking about the sort of animalistic creatures, the griffins and the hydras and the wolfen and stuff like that. What I haven't been talking about is monstrous races. These would be things that have language and the ability to build tools. And as I think I've mentioned in some of my other videos, this is something that I shied away from in Raven of the Scythe and in my world building around this game, because once you have a group that starts talking and creating tools, then I don't think you're necessarily dealing with monsters anymore. I think you're dealing with another species or another race. And while I know the traditional fantasy tropes is that, oh, well, if there's goblins in the hills, then we have to go kill the goblins. That makes all the sense in the world. But that's, if you think about it just a little bit deeper than that, it gets to kind of a different kind of place, where it's like, well, do the goblins have their own language? Do they have their own religions? Do they have their own laws? Like, these aren't monsters, these are people. It just so happens that they're different. And there is definitely nothing wrong with running a typical go in, slay the goblins kind of adventure or making that kind of world, but eventually I think the logical conclusion of this type of setting is civilization, because eventually someone's going to have the idea of, well, why don't we trade with the goblins, or why don't we establish some sort of treaty with them? Like, what if we let the goblins into the city and we can sell them things? Or maybe we can use the goblins as mercenaries or use them for labor or something like that. And then, you start dealing with goblin factory workers or something like that. And that's not really the world I was working on in my head whenever I made Raven of the Scythe. Once again, if that's something that, you want to explore using this rule set, absolutely, go ahead. There's nothing that says you can't, but just from an authorial standpoint, that's not where I was at. So, sticking with, the beasts and the fantastic creatures and stuff like that, I do think that even though, understand, we're dealing with a fantasy world here, and if we tried to apply real world physics and laws of ecology and stuff, a lot of this stuff just wouldn't work. Like, you can't look at a tree of evolution and explain how hydras showed up naturally, or you can't explain through real world aerodynamics how a griffin flies or something like that. So there's no point in trying to be hyper realistic about it, but I do think that you could benefit a lot with your world building or your presentation of your world by paying at least a little bit of lip service to elements of real world ecology. So for instance, if you have an island that's just thick with hydras, that's fine. That sounds like a fun place to go and adventure or whatever. I bet there's some cool treasure there that those hydras have accumulated over time, or maybe there's a buried treasure or whatever. But maybe take some time to think, okay, well, what are those hydras eating? What impact are these hydras having on the local ecosystems? How did all those hydras end up on that island together? Like, what is it that makes them so plentiful here? Things like that. Like, for me, in my game mastering lifespan, in the very, very early days, I didn't think twice about having the players open the doors to a dungeon and finding a pack of wolves. That just made sense to me. They were on the encounter table. Sure, you go in this room and there's wolves there, so this room is going to be the wolf fight room. But it completely changed my perspective on things when I started thinking, okay, well, how did those wolves get there, and what do they eat? And if you apply this same sort of, even just a cursory glance at your world and how things happen, then I think there's a lot more depth that you can basically squeeze out of a role-playing game than just let's go here and kill these hydras. For instance, just while sitting here talking about it, I was thinking maybe the hydras on this island are an issue because that island happens to sit at a place in the lake where a river empties into it, and the hydras are able to just gobble up all of the fish. And so the hydras feeding off the fish coming into this lake from this one choke point sort of are really, really devastating the local communities because now they don't have a reliable supply of fish, so their people are going hungry. So now it's not just an issue of, okay, we need to go to this island to kill the hydras because there's hydras there and there might be treasure, but maybe the local fishermen are concerned because these hydras are taking away their livelihood and their sources of food. Maybe the problem that a wyvern is presenting isn't just because it's a fierce creature that probably has a treasure hoard. Maybe it's interfering with the local livestock or the trade routes or something like that. Maybe there's something on that particular mountain or hill or something that attracted the wyvern in the first place. Do wyverns have mates? Do the young typically stay around with the parents? These are some neat questions that can add a lot to your game and even add some sort of quandaries to the players. For instance, if the only reason the hydras are a problem is because they're eating the fish, then, is it necessarily moral, I guess, to go and kill off all the hydras just because they're just living on an island doing hydra stuff? Are these same adventurers who don't think twice about kicking in a door and slaughtering a whole bunch of wyverns or something going to feel okay whenever they find a nest of wyvern eggs? Are they going to try to sell the eggs? Are they going to smash the eggs to make sure those wyverns don't hatch? Are they maybe going to try to raise the wyverns? There's a lot of interesting questions here that can come up if you just put a slight bit more amount of thought into it, other than monsters exist and they're bad, so we have to kill them. And I'm not saying every single adventure needs to have some pseudo-moral quandary or go into the ecological role of these creatures, because it's entirely possible in your world maybe these creatures aren't natural. Maybe these creatures were put here thanks to a curse 1,000 years ago that caused these unnatural creatures to spawn, and it is the good and righteous thing to go and just slay them wherever you encounter them because they're an abomination against the natural order. That's fine, and if that's the case in your world, then simply knowing that about your world makes it a little bit more interesting, other than just, oh, well, I guess there's hydras. So, those are just some of my thoughts on the presence of monsters in the world and the roles that they should play in your world building or your fantasy role playing or whatever it is. I don't think that, it's necessarily groundbreaking to try to figure out what role in the world these creatures inhabit, but I do think that it adds enough that it's worth the effort. It could be the difference between a shallow, generic adventure or setting and, oh, there's some neat ideas going on here. But those are just my thoughts, and if you have any other ideas about the role monsters should or could play in a fantasy world or role-playing game, by all means, let me know in the comment section below. If you haven't already, you can check out Raven of the Scythe. It's available for free at drivethroughrpg.com. My name is James, and I will talk to you later. Thank you very much for watching.